I won't repeat what Pat has said. Pat hired me in January of 1980 to be a law clerk at AUL. He hired me along with Paige Comstock Cunningham, who's also served, I think, twice as executive director of Americans United for Life, and also Bill Delahoy. Both Paige and Bill were law school classmates of mine, and of course Bill is Melinda's husband, was at the time, and it was a, well, I'll get to that and how much that meant to me at the end of my remarks here. We haven't said much tonight, and I'm not going to say too much about Congressman Henry Hyde himself. His legacy is simply too vast for the moment, and our affection for him is simply too deep. We'd be here all night if we were to talk about Henry. I think it suffices to recall, in addition to Pat's great story about the meeting with the Solicitor General, on that Monday morning in late April 1980, when Harris v. McRae and Williams v. Zabaras were argued before the Supreme Court, when Henry Hyde's great presence filled a generous portion of a middle pew in the chambers of the U.S. Supreme Court, with his Gibraltar-like visage, virtually daring a majority of the justices to strike down his most singular legislative handiwork. As one who in later years worked for Chairman Hyde on Capitol Hill, that visage was not to be taken lightly when it was cast in your direction. May Henry Hyde always be our inspiration. I'll also not attempt to acknowledge all distinguished guests who are here this evening. I think Bob Destro was not here to be welcomed by Charmaine, so I'll please recognize Bob Destro as one of the attorneys for AUL on this case, when we were all much younger. But I do want to say a few words about Pat Truman. You know, Pat was the executive director and general counsel of AUL during what I think we could call the Hyde Amendment years, a 6-year span in which he brought to fruition the goal, as he stated it, of AUL's then chairman, the late Dennis J. Horan, and Victor Rosenblum, and a person who's not been mentioned, Dr. Joe Stanton, that the pro-life movement had to have a professional full-time legal defense fund that was ready to engage in the courts nationwide. I'm very grateful to Bill Saunders for corresponding with his dear friend, Senator and Judge Buckley, and bringing his remarks to bear this evening. And it's very hard to follow Judge and Senator Buckley, but I think his words to us this evening are a challenge and a clarion call for further action on our part. The occasion of our gathering calls for a few reminiscences, a brief tutelage in constitutional law. Maybe Pat's provided enough of that. And given the weather, a tall drink, and I don't want to stand in the way of your second or third drink, so I'll try to be brief. But the reminiscence can be summed up briefly. Without the labors of the AUL Legal Defense Fund and its associated attorneys at Harris and Williams, the arguments that won those cases for the cause of life in the United States Supreme Court would not have been presented, and those cases would have been lost. The legal arm of the pro-life movement, both Americans United for Life and as expanded into other groups that we work with, would not exist, and the array of state laws that, however incompletely, offer some protection to the unborn would not have been enacted. Abortion would have been mainstreamed into American health care, still the unfulfilled goal of Planned Parenthood, NARAL, and its allies. We can and should spend our time together sharing fond memories of those larger-than-life figures who accomplished this. Dennis Horan and Victor Rosenblum, prodded by their Massachusetts co-belligerent Dr. Joe Stanton, each left their indelible stamp on everything AUL does today. Dennis's exacting intelligence and precision, Victor's compassion and unyielding commitment that pro-life was a liberal cause, and Dr. Joe Stanton's copier and fax machines sustained and guided the likes of Pat Truman, Tom Marsden, Burke Balch, us lowly interns, and the rest of our colleagues at 515 North Michigan Avenue in Chicago. But it was what they and the AUL lawyers did that made constitutional history. As Pat has stated, it was their arguments that won the day. The Supreme Court had already decided in 1977 that the government was not required to fund elective abortions through Medicaid. At issue in Harris and Williams was a new and more precise claim that the government was required to fund medically necessary abortions. These procedures, the argument went, were at the core of the liberty in Roe v. Wade. The AUL lawyers knew what a wide loophole that medical necessity exception would create, one wide enough to require funding of virtually any abortion under Medicaid. Their task was to get into both cases, as Pat has described, not just as friends of the court, but as actual litigants. And as Pat has described, accomplishing that to make sure that the proper arguments were made. This was not an easy task, as Pat described, but it was accomplished. 3 decades later, what can we say of this victory? Surely that it has saved lives, perhaps tens of thousands. Surely that it invigorated the pro-life legal movement headed by AUL to new ventures, some of which have succeeded greatly, while others, including the reversal of Roe v. Wade itself, have fallen narrowly, achingly short. Surely that it inspired an entire generation of young pro-life attorneys and law students who have made this cause a stamp of their professional identity, and who are now being succeeded by a much larger cohort of students and young attorneys now active in AUL's expanding network. And we can surely say, in light of the ongoing debate over health care reform, that the Hyde Amendment looms larger than ever. The legislation enacted in March would not have passed but for an insincere pledge to, quote, abide by Hyde in its implementation. And state-by-state effort, and the state-by-state effort to put teeth into that pledge is the latest in AUL's long string of successful legislative strategies. In closing, I would like to say a few words about those gentlemen that I've mentioned, particularly about Victor Rosenblum. I think Dennis's accomplishments have been so well outlined by Pat Truman. None of us would be here tonight if it wasn't for him. Those of us who are fortunate enough to know him, you know, our steps are lighter, our minds are sharper, our intelligence is more challenged by that. Dennis was a superb athlete, a scholarship collegiate football player at the University of Washington. After he was injured and came back and finished his education at Loyola University Chicago in both law and undergraduate in law with the highest distinction. He was also a published poet. Rose very quickly to the top of one of the top trial practice firms in Chicago, and you know, we're talking about a period of about 10 years, and as Pat mentioned, was the chairman of that firm at the time all this was happening. Dennis was the straw that stirred the drink. He kept us together. He kept us focused. He somehow kept the money coming in, often writing the checks himself, and kept this institution alive when it needed to be kept alive. Dr. Joe Stanton, for those of you who knew him, a mythical figure. Stricken by polio, didn't slow him down at all. Great clinician, great teacher, harangued us all to death. You know, a letter, a phone call from Joe Stanton, a letter. They never came with whatever the stamp was then, 15 cents, 14 cents. There were multiple stamps. Because before there were fax machines and the internet, Joe was the fax machine. Joe was the internet. He photocopied stuff. If it was in the New England Journal, in the Archives of Internal Medicine, in the New York Times, in whatever publication he could get his hands on, that thing would be in the mail. 2-3 days later it would be in Chicago. We need to act on this. We need to respond to this. This is for the files. And he probably had the greatest archives of pro-life and pro-life related material. He also saw, despite being a physician, the need for lawyers to carry this cause into the courts, and I had the great privilege of working with him on some cases involving the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, particularly withdrawal of nutrition and hydration that implicated euthanasia and assisted suicide in the 1980s. He was a tough guy to work with, but boy did we learn our stuff. And then finally, Victor Rosenblum, and you know, there's not much one can say, again, without filling an entire evening. Victor, again, was one of those larger-than-life figures. Those who don't know his biography, he was a liberal Democrat, a devout Reformed Jew, the father of 8 children, the youngest of whom was stricken with Down syndrome, if we can say stricken, young Josh. At the time young Josh was born, 1960s, the best advice was put him away. Victor Rosenblum rebelled against that advice with every fiber of his being. I don't think that's what made Victor pro-life, but it sure made him stick to it. Victor was unshakable, immovable. He was prudent. He knew when people were pushing the envelope too far. He knew when some of our friends in the movement wanted to man the barricades, when the time was really, the more prudent course was to build the defenses. But Victor was unshakable. The day before he died, Steve Chapman quoted him in a column in the Chicago Tribune on these very questions. Unshakable commitment to human life, but an unshakable commitment to the way AUL and its allied groups have gone about this, trying to work within the rule of law to bring the shame of abortion, the injustice of abortion to light, and to win this through the legislatures, through the courts. He was my professor. In my darkest days, he was my closest friend. He is with Dennis and Joe, and heaven is a very lively place because the three of them are there. God bless them all. God bless all of you, and God bless especially those who knew those people and knew them by association. And we hope those of us who did know them can impart some of their joie de vivre to this cause for life. Thank you.